This is Juneteenth, Pride, Freedom, and Love, and the talk will proceed in 5 parts. My goal is to think the terms of freedom and love in conjunction with each other, to conceptualize freedom as a yearning that is much broader than legal emancipation, and to do this through honoring ancestors of African descent who gave us signs of what the yearning for freedom meant to them as they refused to have their souls chained by a world incapable of dreaming bigger than its own shackles. So part 1, thank you for that. A look back, Vitória and Francisco Manicongo. The year was 1556, on the islands of Azores off the coast of Portugal, and there an enslaved person from Benin received a set of clothes from their owner. Instead of receiving this clothes, this enslaved person, who was called Antonio by the Portuguese, refused to wear them because they were men's clothing. Antonio, who insisted being called by the name Vitória, wore the clothing of women. A waist jacket buttoned down the front, a vest fashioned from old wool found in the master's stables, and tightly wrapped linen over the hair, topped off with a hat. Now, I've avoided using pronouns to describe Vitória because calling Vitória he or she would likely be a cultural imposition. To the Portuguese enslavers, wedded as they were to their Manichaean worldview of black and white, light and dark, good and evil, male and female, Vitória was confusing at best and an infidel at worst. In addition to whatever labor Vitória was enslaved to do for their master, Vitória also had a private business of their own. Vitória was a sex worker. Records indicate that Vitória had a thriving business. The reason why we know about Vitória at all is because they were caught up in the Portuguese Inquisition, brought before the church to be judged for their identity and their business after a year living in the Azores. Within this archive of slavery, Vitória's resistance, despite her torture, provides us with evidence of a different world that existed before and beyond the ways Portuguese Christians saw the world. Vitória would refuse their assumptions, holding on to fundamental truths embedded in the cultures of Benin and West Africa from which they had been stolen. Standing before the Inquisition, Vitória admitted to her work. In Lisbon and in the Azores, the inquisitors, unable to comprehend Vitória as anything more than a sinning transvestite, asked a series of invasive questions. They asked if most people believed Vitória was a woman. Vitória responded, "I am a woman," and that men willingly paid for their services. When asked about their personal body parts, Vitória said, "I have the orifice of a woman." The inquisitors gagged. What did that mean? Was this some illness? Was this some medical procedure? Vitória replied, "I was born with it," and explained, "There are many in my country who had the same orifice who were born with it." Unsatisfied, the inquisitors moved from invasive questions to an invasive physical inspection and determined that Vitória had the physical character of a man without having any orifice nor other characteristic of a woman. The Inquisition therefore found Vitória guilty of sodomy against nature and sentenced them to life at sea, enslaved in the king's galleys. What Vitória reveals for us is something crucial. Gender is not simply natural or given, but culturally constructed and historically contingent. The Portuguese had determined that there were only two, man and woman. But Vitória indicated that in their home country of Benin, people like them not only existed, but were ordinary and regular members of West African cultures. Indeed, gender expressions were more variable in West Africa, contingent not on a person's physical appearance, but on age, personal desires, spiritualism. And whereas the idea of sodomy was punishable by death in Portugal, the concept didn't exist in Vitória's culture. Instead, as was the case in North America, where there were also third gender categories, in Western Africa, these folks were highly respected because they were thought to have great spiritual power. That is, whereas for Europeans there existed an anxiety around sexuality generally, for West and Central Africans there was more freedom in this idea of diversity of human gender expression. For example, whereas the Portuguese called a person by the name of Francisco Manicongo a sodomite, Francisco called themselves Jinbanda. Francisco was an enslaved person from Central Africa where Portuguese travelers documented, quote, pagan Negroes dressing like women. They married men, they raised families, they participated in community life. Europeans would view them as cross-dressers, but for Central Africans who didn't abide by that notion of a gender binary, one did not cross-dress. These were not men wearing women's clothing, but Jimbanda wearing Jimbanda's clothing. And they had significant spiritual roles in Central Africa. The root of that word, Jimbanda, meant practitioner of medicine. They were often sought after for spiritual help, including the use of fetishes, medicines, burial services, and divination. The Portuguese would call them witches and label them evil sorcerers. The Catholic Church, as did other Christian churches, past and present, used fetishes like holy water and rosaries and practiced divination through spirit possession. So it wasn't the act of magic, the act of spiritual power. It was that it was done outside the authority of the church. But within West African societies, people like Francisco were not viewed as evil. They were viewed as spiritual advisors. One priest who lived in Angola in the 1650s remarked that there is not one captain of war, one village chief, no leader who does not try to keep some of them to watch over him. Without the counsel and approval of such, he will not dare to exercise any act of jurisdiction nor take any resolution. So today we're here to think about and celebrate Juneteenth and Pride in tandem. And it might seem really odd that I started this off by taking us to the 16th century Portuguese world. But for me, this history helps us to see more clearly why these celebrations go hand in hand. Vitória and Francisco's travails reveal that people that today we call transgender or non-binary or genderqueer have existed for as long as we have documented human history. In some cultures, they've been celebrated and venerated. In others, they've been stigmatized, criminalized, and hunted. The historical archives indicate, whether in the distant past or in the present, they've also resisted being erased. And they've opposed the imposition of simple gender binaries, refusing the rules of a kind of theocratic despotism. If part of the celebration of Juneteenth is about honoring the ancestors, it's important to know that people like Vitória and Francisco are among the ancestors too. Additionally, their travails reveal something significant about how we should conceptualize what gender does in our society. First, gender is culturally constructed. The Portuguese had an idea of it. Benin had an idea of it. We can see these differences across time and space. Its definitions, categories, and roles vary across belief systems and time periods. It's not simply another name for the sex you were assigned at birth. Additionally, while for Vitória, gender expression in Benin allowed for a kind of freedom of self-identity, in the context of slavery, unfortunately, we also see that gender can be a form of subordination, a technology or technique of slavery. Over time, slavery was not just the theft of people away from families, it was the theft of names, the theft of languages, but it was also theft of ways of thinking, ways of knowing, ways of relating, and ways of loving. A theft that tore away at the very spirit and soul of enslaved people. If Juneteenth celebrates the enunciation of emancipation, then a joint celebration of Juneteenth and Pride is the announcement of something beyond emancipation, something we might call freedom. To think Juneteenth, Pride, freedom, and love in tandem is to consider the capaciousness of worlds like freedom and love. The freedom to love, the freedom of love, and also freedom as love. Loving others enough to honor their freedom above our own fears and anxieties. So let's talk about Juneteenth. June 19th, 1865, emancipated. So as you can hear, I'm making a distinction between emancipation and freedom. Juneteenth is a commemoration of the former, emancipation, but not necessarily the latter. At the end of the Civil War, Carl Schurz, a general in the Union Army, noted in his report on the condition of the South, the true nature of the situation is this: the slaves are emancipated in point of form, but free labor has not yet been put in the place of slavery in point of fact. The ordinances abolishing slavery passed by the conventions under the pressure of circumstances will not be looked upon as barring the establishment of a new form of servitude. And as we know, Juneteenth commemorates the date June 19th, 1865, the day Union Major General Gordon Granger read General Order Number 3 to the people of Galveston, Texas. Granger's order declared that, in accordance with the Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are free. The Civil War had been effectively over since April 9th, but the fighting continued until the final surrender of the Confederates on the western end of the battles in Galveston on June 2nd, nearby in Tampa that happened on May 6th, and Florida officially proclaimed emancipation on May 20th. And part of what I'm trying to show us is that emancipation was a legal and military process. It happened, it took time to travel across the South. Granger explained in his general order, the freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They would work for these wages under their former enslavers, of course. They are informed, he continued, that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. In short, these people, just freed from slavery, would learn that they were free to work, but not free to rest, or free to move, or free to be. One formerly enslaved Texas woman named Sarah Ford explained how she learned of emancipation and what happened after. She said, when freedom come, I didn't know what that was. I recollect Uncle Charlie Burns would drive the buggy for Master Charles, come running out in the yard and holly, everybody free, everybody free. And pretty soon soldiers comes and Captain reads a mation. And law me, that one time Master Charlie can't open his mouth because the captain tell him to shut up. I would have liked to have seen that. That he do the talking. Then the captain say, I come to tell you the slaves is free and don't have to call nobody master no more. Well, us just mill around like cattle do. Master Charlie say, if an us want to stay, he'll pay us. All except my papa. He say, you can't stay here because you is a bad influence. Indeed, Sarah Ford's father was a bad influence. In slavery, he practiced a certain type of freedom. Charles, the slave owner, was brutal. Sarah explained that if an enslaved person ran away and was caught or returned because they were hungry, the slave driver, known as Uncle Jake, would stretch him out on the ground and tie his hands and feet to posts so he can't move. And then they would take a piece of iron, what he calls the slut, and what is like a block of wood with little holes in it, and fill it up with tallow, and put that iron in the fire till the grease is sizzling hot, and hold it over the poor inwards back, and let that hot grease drip on his hide. Then he'd take the bullwhip and whip it up and down, and after that throw the poor inward in the stockhouse and chain him up a couple days with nothing to eat. My papa carried the grease scars on his back until he died. Sarah Ford's dad was a frequent runaway. But Charles, while he was enslaved, had no interest in selling him. He was the best leather maker around. So her father practiced running away as a kind of freedom, an effort to steal himself away from chattel slavery, even if only for fleeting moments. And so when emancipation came, Charles didn't want to employ him. Charles didn't want a free man. Charles's vision of the new world was one where these people were emancipated, but still enslaved. He didn't want Sarah's father to teach them how to be free. He couldn't stay because he was a bad influence. Over the course of the 19th century, despite the imagined legal protections of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, which abolished slavery except for people who commit crimes, the 14th, which guaranteed citizenship to the formerly enslaved, and descendants by birth, which we know is currently under attack by the Trump administration, and the 15th, which extended the right to vote to all adult male citizens, which is under attack across the whole country, it seems, with gerrymandering. The former Confederates and enslavers rose back to power and chipped away at those so-called guaranteed constitutional rights through black codes. For example, anti-vagrancy laws were either newly enacted or were enforced with new vigor and ferocity during the rise of a period that we now call Jim Crow. Employees of the Freedmen's Bureau documented how police indiscriminately arrested all colored laborers who were found in the streets, not employed just at the moment when the police saw them. Not a day passes without dozens of men being sent to me as vagrants, many of whom I release immediately upon ascertaining they've been arrested unjustly. After the Freedmen's Bureau was dismantled following the Compromise of 1877, states across the South established chain gangs and convict leasing systems that provided for incarcerated people to be forced back into labor for the state or for private parties. In Mobile, Alabama, one witness estimated seeing 50 black people arrested daily on suspicion of vagrancy, not having a job that a white person would vouch for. In Nashville, 2,000 so-called vagrant Negroes were arrested in a single sweep. In San Antonio, Texas, the newspaper bragged that all the vagrant Negroes who had been here loitering about the city were now working on chain gangs. If emancipated people could not prove that they were employed by a white person who would vouch for them, they could be convicted of vagrancy and re-enslaved. What kind of freedom is that? English scholar Saidiya Hartman explains that emancipation was a kind of burden placed on newly freed people, or so-called freed people. That citizenship, specifically citizenship for the black person, was a responsibility, not a right. She explains, the ascribed responsibility of the liberal individual served to displace the nation's responsibility for providing and ensuring the rights and privileges conferred by the Reconstruction Amendments, and it shifted the burden of duty onto the freed. It was their duty to prove their worthiness for their freedom, rather than the nation's duty to guarantee at minimum the exercise of liberty and equality, if not opportunities for livelihood other than debt peonage. Emancipation had been the catalyst for a transformed definition of citizenship and a strengthened national state. She's referring to the 14th Amendment there. But the national identity that emerged in this aftermath consolidated itself by casting out the emancipated from the revitalized body of the nation state that their transit incorporation created. In other words, on the one hand, the Reconstruction Amendments that were motivated by the need to codify emancipation and citizenship in the law expanded our understanding of what it meant to belong, to be a member of this nation. On the other hand, now that these formerly enslaved people were considered citizens under this expanded definition, they had a new burden to prove that they deserved it. Part 3, I Dream a World, or Emancipation and Freedom. In many ways, African American history is defined by this conceptual distance, this distinction between emancipation and freedom. We've witnessed time and again that the law doesn't guarantee freedom. The law is a tool of politics, and politics is a fancy word for power. The power to determine how we all get to live. And if that were not enough of a constraint against freedom, in American history, this power has been wielded, controlled, and monopolized by people with the most wealth. And while civil rights leaders have allowed for some diversity in the leadership class of the United States, this year, this nation turns 250 years old. There are still 17 states that haven't had a female governor. There are still 45 states that have never had a black governor. And more importantly, the halls of power remain populated by the wealthy. Their wealth and power provide them all sorts of freedoms. Now, FDR defined or articulated the 4 freedoms during World War II as the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedom from want and from fear can be added to the long list of other freedoms African Americans clamored for during Jim Crow. Freedom to move, freedom to rest, freedom to buy, freedom to recreate, freedom to love across the color line, freedom to create, and freedom for all. They didn't just want freedom of or freedom from, they wanted freedom to and freedom for. It was not an abstraction they sought, but a material condition. They wanted to live freely. And Langston Hughes captured this idea in his poem, I Dream a World. He wrote, I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth, and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream, where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free, where wretchedness will hang its head, and joy like a pearl attends the needs of all mankind. Of such, I dream my world. And this was certainly the case of black people who back then were called inverts and deviants during the Harlem Renaissance when Hughes wrote this poem. Today, we might identify them as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, pansexual, asexual, the list goes on and on. These terms were not in vogue during the Jim Crow period, but these people were there, just as Vitória and Francisco were. Like those ancestors, Black Americans living in the 20th century United States also had to face off against a strict, sexually anxious culture in state politics and church politics. During the Harlem Renaissance in New York, this was the time of Negro Vogue. And it was all the rage. Everybody wanted to hang out at these clubs. White people would leave their segregated neighborhoods and flood into Harlem after dark looking for the thrills of Black music, illegal alcohol, temptation, and pleasure. And in these spaces, queer Black people were not only visible, they were often central. Preachers railed against the evils of homosexuality from the pulpit. Anti-vice organizations exposed purported dens of iniquity and published reports. And newspapers increased the visibility of these people. This is how we know they were there. In June 1929, the Amsterdam News publicized a 19-year-old's arrest for, quote, masquerading in female attire. Same gender-loving Black women weren't spared criminalization. They were often accused of seeking to groom young girls. When incarcerated white women in the South were placed with Black women, Black girls and women were accused of being a corrupting influence on them, allegedly exposing them to improper sexual behaviors with other women. But this was more than just an attack against what white lawmakers and law enforcement officials considered degenerate behaviors. It was authority over the making of race and the meaning of race through the gender of technology. Gender had been used as an ideology to subjugate people of African descent through claims that Africans had not properly evolved to the level of racial manhood. Since the 19th century, in fact, white leaders and thinkers had determined, quote, the Black seems to me to be the female race within the human family, as the white is the male race. Just as for a woman, the Black is deprived of the intellectual aptitude for politics and science, but on the other hand, he possesses to the highest degree the qualities of the heart, affections, and domestic feelings. He is a man of the interior, like a woman. He also passionately loves his finery, dancing, and singing. This little dab of misogyny to go with your racism. The stereotypes about Black people were all suffused with this gendered understanding of the so-called races. If the Black was the female race of the human family, it meant that the Black was subservient to the white race because the Black had not fully evolved to manhood. This was because, as the Europeans surmised, the peoples of African descent hadn't established appropriate gender boundaries. The women of Africa had too much social and political power, the men too little authority in turn, and as sexual beings collectively, they lacked discipline. In other words, the entire racial group was considered and conceived as an invert race, a queer race. In 1897, as historian Sarah Haley explains, there were at least 43 articles published describing Black life as queer, strange, most of which recounted lurid tales of the reporter's court. Queer was most constantly used in Atlanta's mainstream press to describe perverse Black bodies, ideas, and behaviors that could only be interpreted and governed through police and judicial action. Unfortunately, by this time, many African Americans' memories of their ancestors who existed before and beyond colonialism and slavery had vanished. And in place of those memories, they adopted the beliefs and attitudes of their enslavers. Though emancipated, freedom was not so easily or simply returned to. And so queer Black people were viewed as an inconvenience to the race, an embarrassment, and a perversion. To Black leaders who sought respectability through European notions of proper gender conformity. And perhaps African Americans can never return to a freedom stolen. Perhaps their only option was to create a new freedom. And create they did. Historian James Wilson notes, escaping from public view, many lesbian and gay men during the Harlem Renaissance, I'm talking about, developed elaborate social systems to avoid detection. In Harlem, for instance, private homes became exclusive places for homosexual congregation and performances for a night. From tenement buildings to upscale apartment buildings, private parties in Harlem became the safest way for lesbians and gay men to meet, sing, dance, and drink plenty of bootlegged alcohol. Because of the dire concern for periodic moral crackdowns by the city and police, the Harlem homosexual subculture, particularly a burgeoning lesbian community, developed a flourishing social network operating out of private spaces. Mabel Hampton remarked that lesbians often took rooms next to one another, and the girls, as she referred to them, had parties every other night. And as Lillian Faderman explains, it may not have surprised many residents of the era to know that there was a whole boarding house full of lesbians who were allowed to live in Harlem undisturbed. And while they sometimes gathered within these private parties, queer Black people also created an elaborate annual fairies ball through the 1920s and 30s. Such drag balls were at their zenith during the early years of the Great Depression, when they could attract nearly 6,000 revelers, including thousands of white onlookers enthralled and enchanted by what newspapers call the spectacle, with the members of the third sex of both races. The Amsterdam News, which was a Black-owned newspaper, would report men dance with men, women dance with women, an occasional heated love affair was observed in the corners and crevices of Rockland Palace. Observers documented that in the dark corners of the balcony of the ballroom, several couples were seen making love in the most amorous way. Love flared hot and quick. People openly kissed and caressed one another. In the midst of so much repression and so much hiding, queer Black people had created a space that was public and legally sanctioned, where they could express, where they had the freedom to be, the freedom to love, the freedom to misbehave, the freedom to break the rules, the freedom to create their own worlds anew, if only for one very long night. Part 4. You Can't Hurt Me to Be Magic. Now, living what we now call out and proud was no easy task. During the Harlem Renaissance, only one writer, Bruce Nugent, was out and proud. His novel Gentleman Jigger was only published posthumously, and Nugent passed away without much to his name. Queer life would still be defined by a culture of discretion, and increasingly so as the nation escaped the Great Depression and welcomed militarism and McCarthyism as sacrosanct creeds. This is a lesson that Bayard Rustin would learn. Bayard Rustin was born in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Adults viewed him as a young Renaissance man. He played sports, he was an eloquent writer, an enchanting singer. He was deeply loved by his grandparents, who recognized his talents and also his queerness early on. He was also raised as a Quaker, oriented in his youth towards a world where everyone was dignified and where there would be no more war. Rustin's name has recently been revived by historians since he passed away in 1987, and though he's often treated as a background character to Dr. King's story, the two actually met pretty early on in Dr. King's career when he was kind of just a fledgling preacher. During the early months of the Montgomery bus boycott, when with the endorsement of Coretta Scott King, who had no problems with Rustin's sexuality, MLK agreed to accept Rustin as an advisor. And over the years, MLK would depend heavily on Bayard Rustin, from training people on nonviolence in places across the South to the famous 1963 March on Washington. In fact, Rustin was the primary organizer of the March on Washington, of working alongside his friend A. Philip Randolph. However, other civil rights leaders would request that at the march, Rustin not be allowed to speak, fearing that his identity as gay and his past arrest and imprisonment would sully the name of the movement. Once again, he was told discretion. Long before he met Dr. King, Rustin had been active in the civil rights, in the struggle for civil rights, the struggle against militarism and war, and the fight for economic fairness for poor and working people. He was also boldly comfortable in his own skin, even before he understood the implications of his sexuality. He would, quote, build special bonds with male friends at school, and he never worried about bringing them home, but he remembered his grandmother Julia telling him once, and I'll put this quote back up here, "I want to recommend something to you. In selecting your male friends, you should be careful that you associate with people who have as much to lose as you. You have a very good reputation. People who do not have as much to lose as you can be careless." In her own way, Julia was telling Rustin that she knew and accepted him as he was, but that the world didn't, that he would have to live a life of discretion. But discretion was difficult for Rustin. It was a type of constraint, a hold on his heart, chains on his body, a cage around his mind, slavery of the soul. And he desperately wanted to be free, even as he wanted the world to be free. After being arrested while in college for hooking up with another male in a public place, Rustin left Pennsylvania for New York City, where he became respected as a brilliant organizer, thinker, and actor in the peace movement. His life would take him across the United States and around the world, learning and teaching others about nonviolence and anti-colonialism in organizations like the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And just as boldly as he appreciated his own identity as a gay black man, he also boldly confronted the indignities of racism everywhere he traveled. In 1942, on a bus ride from Louisville to Nashville, Rustin recalled, "I was riding in a bus, and I was wearing a red necktie. It was hot, and I had it open, and it was dangling, and as I boarded the bus, a woman was sitting with a child on her lap. And the child, as I was jiggling for my ticket, and my tie was flying and my bags were going, the child reached over and grabbed my tie. And the mother hit it and said, 'Don't touch,' an N-word. I had not seen this kind of thing before, so I went in the back and sat down, and I began doodling in the back seat by myself, and all of a sudden something began to happen. Next to me was a black couple who had a box with chicken in it and having the best time on earth. And I said, how many years are we going to let that child be misled by its mother? That if we sit in the back, that we're really having fun. Then whites in a way have the right to say they like it in the back. I vowed then and there I was never going through the South again without either being arrested or thrown off the bus for protesting." So Rustin moved to the whites-only section of the bus. During multiple stops, the driver and Rustin exchanged words. Rustin explained that he could not in good conscience obey an unjust law. Finally, the driver called the police. Rustin's commitment to nonviolence would now be tested. The officers ordered him to move. He refused. In front of the passengers, the officers ruthlessly beat Rustin, dragging him off the bus, throwing him into the police car, and then tossing him around among each other at the police station as each cop took their turn attacking him. Rustin remained nonviolent. And finally, the police captain, perplexed as to why Rustin was not fighting and why he seemed unafraid, said, "I believe this N-word is crazy." Rustin was eventually released when the assistant district attorney refused to file charges, and then his name spread like wildfire through the peace movement. Rustin's contemporaries showered him with adoration, calling him electric, charismatic, prophetic, and magnetic as he continued to work in the peace movement. Everywhere he went, people were enamored by his style, his eloquence, his hoity-toity accent that he perfected and performed to add an air of sophistication, and also his moral certitude on the issues of civil rights and nonviolence. Historian John D'Amelio writes, Helen Winmore, a Quaker activist in Columbus, Ohio, saw him as charismatic, a kind of person who was the embodiment of something. Glenn Smiley remembered him as a sensation. There was a magic about Bayard. He sang like an angel. Smiley, who later served as a confidant to Martin Luther King, said of Rustin, "He was my guru, and I learned practically everything I knew at the time of importance about nonviolence from Bayard. I would never have had the courage to have started without the impetus that Bayard gave me. On top of that, he was the most beautiful guy," Margaret Rohrer said after meeting him for the first time. "We are all in love with him," remembered Secretary Shizu Asahi. He attracted men and women alike, though after having been arrested and scolded multiple times for his indiscretions, he had learned to compartmentalize his life. And this was the challenge that would ultimately bring severe shame to the peace movement after Rustin was arrested in Pasadena, California in 1953. He was convicted of lewd vagrancy for performing consensual oral sex on two white men in a car. He was required to register as a sex offender. His mentors and friends in the peace movement were aghast. They had known about Rustin's sexuality. They had endured embarrassment for his behaviors in the past. But from their point of view, this threatened the peace movement's reputation. Rustin had been warned by these leaders and his friends to what? Be discreet. And he failed. Prior to that most infamous 1953 arrest in California, in 1944, he had already been to jail. He had elected to go to jail as a conscientious objector rather than to serve and work on war camps. which is where SEALs were sent rather than the battlefield. Rustin thought that his imprisonment would be a principled stand for the peace movement and would provide him an opportunity to agitate among other prisoners. He wanted to teach them American history, which he convinced jailers to allow him to do. Specifically, he wanted to teach white imprisoned people American history. His incarcerated time was difficult, but he did win over his jailers. Perhaps naively, he thought that if white prisoners saw him in a teacher's role, their prejudices against black people might be challenged. He also refused to accept the segregated dining facilities, and he convinced the prison to allow for voluntary desegregation of other spaces. Rustin used this freedom of movement to congregate with white conscientious objectors in the white sections of his cell block, and he would cross the color line on Sundays to listen to the symphony on the radio. But on one Sunday, an inmate named Judge Huddleston furiously attacked Rustin. Rustin's white friends rushed to protect him, but Rustin told them to refrain. He told them to stay committed to nonviolence. And covering his head under Huddleston's blows, he repeatedly told his attackers, "You can't hurt me." Rustin ended up with a broken wrist and was disciplined by the warden, but this was a major win for Rustin. It gave him and the peace movement high moral ground. News spread rapidly inside and outside of the prison of the power of nonviolent resistance. But Rustin was also a lover, and his choice to love freely compromised the position he had created for himself in the prison. As he neared a win toward a more institutionalized desegregation of the prison, Rustin's reputation was shattered when he was accused of sexual impropriety. He had never been closeted in prison, but his behaviors were sometimes interpreted in different ways. Maybe he was just an artistic man, or maybe he just was an agitator who liked to defy social norms. The way he held his body closely to other men, or sang in a high soprano, or rubbed the thighs of friends. But his, quote, gestures, the pitch of his voice, his accent, physical grace, sardonic wit, his cultivated taste could be variously interpreted as forms of theatricality, sophistication, or sensitivity. As others had said already, Rustin was like magic. But like Francisco and Vitória, his magic was easily condemned as evil by the inquisitors, in this case the prison administration, who held their own secular inquisition. They brought witnesses in from among the other prisoners who would testify that Rustin had kissed and made sexual contact with others. Donald Clemmer, a Bureau of Prison psychologist, determined that Rustin impresses me as a confirmed homosexual whose conceit is so extreme and whose traits are so deep in the personality that in combining these two features, he could not refrain from further such acts. Not only was Rustin's campaign for integration defeated, so was his ability to convince his jailers to respect him and his conscience in any way. Rustin received his most heartbreaking condemnation from his most trusted mentor, A.J. Must, who wrote in a letter, "You have been guilty of gross misconduct, especially reprehensible in a person making the claims to leadership, in a sense moral superiority in which you are making. You have deceived everybody, including your comrades and most devoted friends. You were capable of making the mistake of thinking that you could be the leader in a revolution of the most basic and intricate kind at the same time that you were a weakling in an extreme degree and engaged in practices for which there was no justification, which a person with the tenth of your brains must have known would defeat your objective. You are still far from facing reality in yourself. In the self that has been and still is you, there is nothing to respect, and you must ruthlessly cast out everything in you which prevents you from facing that." Now, Rustin, as I mentioned, would go on to teach Dr. King even after this. He would become, again, the leading organizer behind the March on Washington. He would lead nonviolent movements in the United States and in Africa. But the distance between emancipation and freedom continued to characterize his life. Restricted from the freedom to simply be and to become whomever he wished, Rustin had been told repeatedly and in various ways throughout his life, all the slaves are free, and then immediately instructed to stay on the plantation, to work, love, rest, and recreate only as others saw fit. Part 5, looking to the present, the freedom too. So as I prepared this closing today, I wanted to end by telling the story of Rustin rather than some of the more familiar ones like Stonewall. I wanted to go further back in time to remind us of people like Vitória, Francisco Manicongo, the fairies, pansies, and managed women and drag queens of the 1920s and 1930s, and Bayard Rustin for two major reasons. First, thinking about Juneteenth and Pride collectively demands a longer and deeper historical inquiry than the 1950s might allow. Because the fundamental question here isn't about the freedom to love or to marry or to be free from criminalization. These are important, but they are legal processes. They are questions of emancipation, not really questions of freedom. What these ancestors reveal is that freedom precedes and exceeds the law. The law could punish them, but it couldn't erase them. Society could constrain them, but it couldn't extinguish them. Something within the very core of their being, some call it a soul, some call it a consciousness, some the universe or energy, but something demanded, despite the risk, to be free. And this wasn't simply, again, a freedom of or a freedom from, it was a freedom to and a freedom for, a freedom to become, the freedom to explore, the freedom to create. And while the world used politics to destroy the urge to become, these ancestors kept on creating. Second, thinking of Juneteenth and Pride together compels ruminations on love. And unfortunately, we are witnessing a politics of hatred, control, provincialism, and tribalism once again try to destroy our collective capacity to become something better and greater together. Books are being banned to prevent children from developing their imaginations beyond what some people view as the right kind of indoctrination. The U.S. military is being deployed against U.S. citizens, and undocumented immigrants are being denied due process. Palestinians and Sudanese are suffering all sorts of violence and genocide before our eyes. And in the case of Palestine, that's being funded by the United States. Here at home, the trans panic is encouraging not only acts of discrimination, but also fatal violence. A cisgender black woman was killed by a white man because he thought she was trans. Once again highlighting the queerness of blackness in these white supremacist imaginations. The Southern Baptist Convention is hoping to convince the Supreme Court to overturn Obergefell, which nationalized the right for same-sex couples to marry. The SBC also recently voted to cast out churches with women leaders, pastors. Here, close to home at the University of South Florida, every single course in African and African American studies and women's and gender studies were stripped from the general education curriculum. Not even by the state, but by the university's lawyers. If perfect love casts out fear, we have to ask what these people have been afraid of, and why they have sought the subjugation of black and queer people for as far back as the historical records show. Recently, Joe Rigney published a book called The Sin of Empathy. It's a very tortured attempt to argue that empathy is not inherently good, that while it may be good under the constraints he favors, empathy is inherently corruptible. He's anti-feminist, anti-gay, anti-black, anti-reparations. He opposes the redistribution of wealth from the wealthy to the poor, but he smiles upon the redistribution of our tax dollars to the wealthy, suggesting that this version of God is okay with such gross inequalities that some people live in estates valued at millions of dollars in the same country where others live under overpasses and in dark, forgotten tunnels. He purposefully deploys his own sacrosanct text, the Holy Bible, to maintain the status quo. Like the Inquisitors, he wants the freedom to shape the world in his image, and he, like so many others, claims moral authority to do so because he says it's his God's will. In a recent interview, he concluded, the bottom line question is, who's God? Is our feelings God or is God God? And if God is God, then we should do what he says. And he's going to set boundaries in order, and he's going to govern our minds, and our minds will govern our passions. On the other hand, the deep root here is in our fallen state. Our passions lead us astray, and they lead us astray, and they guide us to all sorts of folly and destruction if we let them run. And if we join together into a big blob of emotion, you don't just destroy yourself, but you destroy your family, you destroy your church, you destroy your community. So there is a deep fundamental theological question behind all of this, and it is God God or are feelings God? Rigney and those like him are saying God, but their gods are culturally constructed. And I don't say this to offend anyone's belief systems. What I'm trying to say is that just like gender existed across different cultures and were appreciated and expressed differently, so too do people define their God or their gods in their own image. And Rigney has constructed his God against human feeling, against the passions of people like Vitória, Francisco, and Bayard, Rustin, against the passions, the yearning for freedom of those people enslaved at Galveston who were delivered the message of Juneteenth. These feelings, whether desires for intimacy, moral desires for justice, spiritual desires to create, have been constructed as an enemy. When enslaved people ran away from plantations, following their passions to be free, psychologists constructed a new disease. They called it drapetomania, claiming that these people had to be mentally ill because they were running to freedom. Because these passions, these feelings, these yearnings challenge the existing order and the ways of thinking. They question the rules that have been imposed, rules created by people that are claimed by these people to be natural and divine. And so Rigney and those like him, whether inquisitors, slave owners, or Rustin's prison guards, sought to discipline and punish, to bring suffering to those who have other types of dreams, who dare to be otherwise. They are in the end afraid of freedom, because freedom is love of self and others without borders, and borders are the first apparatus for holding power. And this love would drive us to recreate the world, a world that doesn't tolerate pointless suffering, but rather one where care is the guiding ethic. So I'll close with the words of Bayard Rustin, who arrived in Oxford, Ohio to speak at the Western College for Women in June 1964. This was just before his arrival. News had come out that James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, two white and one black civil rights activists who were in Mississippi trying to help people learn how to register to vote, had gone missing. They were feared dead. We would later learn that the three were murdered by the Klan. There in Ohio, they feared this might be the coming news. It terrified the volunteers who were being taught nonviolence, who were being taught you cannot take weapons with you. They said, we're being sent as sacrificial victims. Rustin spoke to the crowd. He drew their love and respect when he said, all mankind is my community. When I say I love Mississippi Senator James Eastland, it sounds preposterous. A man who brutalizes people. But you love him or you wouldn't be here. You're going to Mississippi to create social change. And you love Eastland in your desire to create the conditions which will redeem his children. Loving your enemy is manifest in putting your arms, not around the man, but around the social situation to take power from those who misuse it, at which point they can become human too. So thank you all for listening to this. I hope this has given you something to think about as we celebrate Juneteenth, and also today, the 11th anniversary of the Charleston church shooting. Because we have to learn how to think about love and freedom more broadly. We still reach for what our ancestors reached for. So I hope that we find courage in their stories and that we follow their footsteps.